Welcome back, everybody. You know, 1864, during the Civil War, was a turning point, really.
Oh, absolutely. A year of incredible contrasts. You see the Confederacy just clinging to hope, but they're facing these mounting losses.
Yeah, and the Union's finally unified, right?
Yeah.
Under a leader who is, well, he's determined to end this thing, no matter the cost.
And the costs were high. Looking at these sources, it really brings it all to life, Not just the strategies and the big battles, but the stories of the soldiers who fought and died.
Right, and I mean, the stories are what really stuck with me, too. Like letters from soldiers who actually pinned their names and addresses to their uniforms
Wow.
before battle, just in case.
Just in case, yeah. Imagine that. Imagine the weight of knowing that every single fight could be your last.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. It really kind of sets the stage for the first big event we're going to look at, Jim Stewart's death at the Battle of Yellow Tavern.
Yeah, Stuart. He was more than just a commander. I mean, a skilled cavalry commander, sure, but he was a symbol for the Confederacy.
Yeah. Reading through the sources, he's described almost like this mythical figure,
Yeah.
you know, flamboyant, known for these daring raids.
Yeah.
He was practically a folk hero down south.
He was. So when he was mortally wounded in that battle, May 11th, 1864, chaos everywhere. It really sent shockwaves through the Confederacy.
I bet.
One source even mentions Stuart predicting his own death. He told one of his men, "I do not expect to survive this war."
Wow.
Chilling, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, the impact of his loss, that must have been,
Oh, it was significant. Some historians even say losing Stuart was as bad as losing Stonewall Jackson the year before.
really
Oh, yeah. Think about it. What that would have done to morale for the Confederates?
just deflating.
Totally. And it's right at this time, with the Confederacy reeling, that Ulysses S. Grant, he starts to rise on the Union side.
Now, Grant, he's a fascinating figure, wouldn't you say?
He,
I mean, the sources describe him as unassuming, quiet guy, but with this iron will and a real knack for strategy.
no pomp and circumstance with Grant. He was all business, and he had this drive, this absolute drive to win. And maybe even more importantly, Lincoln trusted him.
That partnership, Lincoln and Grant, it's remarkable. We have telegrams between them, and you can see the respect they had. They understood what needed to be done, end the war, preserve the Union. There's even that story about Lincoln. He used a metaphor to describe their relationship.
Oh, yeah, the one about skinning a critter.
Yeah. Even if you can't skin it, you can at least hold a leg while someone else does the skinning.
That's them in a nutshell. Lincoln, the politician, backing Grant up, and Grant, the military man, taking charge on the ground.
And with Lincoln behind him, Grant launches his Overland campaign, spring of 1864.
And this campaign, this is where you really see Grant's strategic genius.
Okay, so how so?
Well, he wasn't focused on just grabbing land. He wanted to grind down the Confederate army, wear them out, target their manpower, their supplies.
So a real change in strategy for the Union, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Union commanders before, they weren't keen on this kind of fighting, too costly. But Grant knew to win this war, he had to break the Confederacy, even if it meant taking heavy losses.
And he did take heavy losses. The Overland campaign had some of the most brutal battles of the entire war, starting with the Wilderness in May of '64.
That was a tough one. Imagine fighting in that dense forest, smoke everywhere, you can't see anything. And then on top of it all, wildfires, sweeping through the battlefield.
Oh, my God.
Horrible. And even with those heavy casualties, Grant didn't back down. He pushed south, engaged Lee again a week later, Spotsylvania Courthouse.
That's where you hear about the mule shoe, right?
The Mule Shoe Salient. Yeah, a bulge in the Confederate lines. Some of the most intense fighting of the whole war happened right there.
The sources, they describe it like like a meat grinder, hand-to-hand fighting, trenches, just carnage.
It was. And Spotsylvania is one of the first times we see trench warfare on that scale during the Civil War. It's kind of a foreshadowing of, what comes later in other wars.
Yeah, and then there's Emory Upton, this young Union colonel. He leads this daring but ultimately tragic attack on the mule shoe.
Upton, he was innovative. Used a concentrated column of troops, punched a hole right through the Confederate lines, but no support. His men had to retreat. Heavy losses.
Another example of, just the human cost. So much bravery, but victory was just so expensive.
It was, and that cost, it just kept going up as the Overland campaign went on. From Spotsylvania, Grant pressed south again. More battles, more clashes leading up to Cold Harbor. early June.
Cold Harbor. That was just, well, they say it's one of the most one-sided, brutal battles of the war.
Union casualties way higher than the Confederates. The sources, they describe waves of Union soldiers just being mowed down. Confederate fire just tore them apart, trying to assault entrenched positions. Just a massacre.
But Grant, even after all that, he kept going.
He did. He would not give Lee a break. That's what's so remarkable about Grant in this campaign. He's relentless. He understood. Every engagement, no matter how bad the losses, it chipped away at Lee, at the Confederacy, their resources, their manpower.
So even if it looked like a stalemate, to some people, Grant was winning a war of attrition.
Exactly. He had Lee and the Confederacy backed into a corner, and they couldn't get out.
So we left off with Grant just hounding Lee, and then Cold Harbor. That awful battle. It's hard to imagine what those soldiers went through. I mean, not just the losses, but the impact on their morale, you know?
You're right. It had to be devastating. And the sources we have, they really show that, like diary entries, soldiers talking about exhaustion, fear, this feeling that the war might never end. One soldier even wrote that it was like a blind and bloody hunt to the death.
Man, that's grim. It's a good reminder that for those guys on the ground, it wasn't about, I don't know, fancy strategies or politics. It was just about staying alive.
Absolutely. That's why these firsthand accounts are so important. They give us a real sense of the human cost, the real cost of this war. You can't just look at casualty numbers.
So how did Grant, how did he deal with that human cost? He was clearly okay with heavy losses to get what he wanted, but was there a limit?
That's a tough one. Historians still debate that. But from what we see, Grant did understand he had to balance those aggressive tactics with, with keeping his men going.
Is that why he switched from direct assaults to the siege at Petersburg?
Yes. By June 64, Grant saw that attacking Lee's army head-on, it was just too costly. He needed a new approach, one that would save Union lives, but still keep the pressure on.
So what's a siege exactly? For those listening who might not be familiar with all the military terms.
Basically, a siege is when one army surrounds a fortified place, cut off supplies, bombard them, try to force a surrender.
So it's not about those big dramatic battles anymore. It's more like a slow grind.
Exactly. Grant knew he couldn't just beat Lee in one big fight at Petersburg. The defenses were too strong. So he decided to starve them out, slowly wear them down.
And that siege, it wasn't just about supplies, right? It must have really messed with the Confederates' heads.
Oh, yeah. Imagine being trapped in Petersburg, Union artillery pounding you day and night, knowing you're running out of food, no reinforcements, no way out.
Just awful.
It was. And you see that despair in the sources. Letters from Confederate soldiers, they called it a living hell, always facing death.
But they held out, didn't they? Almost 10 months. Why? Was it just duty or something more?
I think it was a lot of things. Duty, loyalty to their cause, but also a real fear of what would happen if they surrendered.
Fear of what the Union would do.
Right. Many Confederate soldiers, they believed that if they surrendered, they'd be punished, thrown in prison, maybe even executed.
So it was lose-lose. Fight and probably die. Or surrender and risk something even worse.
Yeah, that's it. And it shows just how tough the choices were for soldiers on both sides.
But Grant, while the Confederates were stuck in Petersburg, he wasn't just sitting around, was he?
No, not at all. During the siege, he was busy elsewhere. Sent troops to disrupt Confederate supply lines, attack their other strongholds.
So it was like a war on multiple fronts. Keep Lee busy in Petersburg, but also, weaken the whole Confederacy.
Exactly. Grant knew Petersburg was important, but it was just one piece. To truly win, he had to break the Confederacy everywhere.
And it worked, didn't it?
It did. That constant pressure at Petersburg and everywhere else, it wore the Confederacy down.
They were running out of everything. Men, supplies, hope.
And it's around this time that something interesting happens. The whole dynamic between Grant and Lee, it shifts.
What do you mean?
Well, before this, Lee was the one calling the shots. He was outsmarting the Union, winning against all odds. But with Grant in charge, everything changed.
Grant became the aggressor. Lee had to react to defend.
Exactly. And that change in momentum, that's what led to the Union victory.
So even though Petersburg might seem like this long, drawn-out thing, it was really important. It was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. And it really cemented Grant's reputation as a brilliant leader.
That's right. And as we move into the last part of our deep dive, we'll see how Grant's determination ultimately leads to Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse.
We've been talking about the siege of Petersburg, and wow, just the pressure Grant put on Lee's army. It was brutal, but, there's light at the end of the tunnel, right?
Yeah, I like that. A new dawn for the Union. But a dawn that came after a lot of sacrifice, So much hardship.
It's true. The stories we've looked at really show that, soldiers on both sides just reaching their limit, starvation, disease, losing hope.
Yeah, it's incredible how much they endured. But by March 1865, for Lee's army, things were just falling apart.
No supplies, their lines were weak,
Hmm.
and Grant was closing in.
Time was running out. Lee knew it. He tried one last thing, attacked Fort Stedman March 25th, 1865.
One last shot. Try to break through, maybe turn things around.
Exactly. But it didn't work. And that's when Lee knew Petersburg was lost.
So then what? He just surrendered right there.
Not quite. On the night of April 2nd, Lee abandoned Petersburg, headed west, tried to get away from Grant.
Must have been chaotic, huh?
Oh, it was. Thousands of Confederate soldiers, exhausted, defeated, marching through Virginia with the Union right behind them.
I mean, they were trapped?
They were. Grant chased them down, cut off their escape routes, more fighting. The Confederates, they were already so weak.
And that led to Appomattox, right?
Yes. April 9th, 1865. Lee knew it was over. He sent a message to Grant, wanted to talk surrender.
And that meeting, it happened at Appomattox Courthouse, that little village in Virginia. I mean, that place it's a part of history now.
It is, and the sources really capture the moment. Grant, he was always practical, offered Lee and his men generous terms, let them go home, keep their horses, their belongings.
Wow. We've been talking about all this brutality, and then Grant's just was he thinking ahead, trying to make peace easier, or was he just being a good guy?
Probably both. Grant knew if he punished the Confederates, it would just keep the bad feelings going, make it harder to put the country back together.
He was thinking about the future.
He was. By being kind to Lee, he helped to make things a little less painful for everyone.
It's a good reminder that even after a terrible war like this, there's always room for compassion.
Absolutely. And it shows what kind of leaders Grant and Lee were. They were enemies, but they respected each other, and they wanted to end the war the right way, with honor.
So, we've spent this deep dive looking at 1864, such a tough year. What are some of the big things you hope people will remember?
Well, I think the main thing is this was a really complicated time. It wasn't just about battles. It was about people's lives being changed forever.
Yeah, we've seen it all, haven't we? The courage, the heartbreak, the hope.
We have. And I hope people will understand Grant and Lee better. They were on different sides, but they both wanted the same thing in the end, to stop the fighting.
And I hope everyone listening will want to learn even more.
There are so many stories from this time, so many things to discover, so keep asking questions, keep searching for answers. Don't ever stop learning about the past.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time as we explore more stories from history.